All right, Cherubs, thank you for joining us once again. Where today my very special guest is Dr. Peter Rogers. Peter is an MD in the States, as I understand it, and also a proponent of the vegan ideology. Is that right, Peter? Both of those things?
I would say the vegan diet, no ideology.
Oh, no ideology. So you're going to tell us about the? Are you going to tell us about the
I'm not a
vegan
big fan.
science?
I'm not a big fan of those animal rights people. The same people who promote animal rights are the ones that are against human rights, has been my experience. So I'm not a fan of that.
Cool bananas. All right. So what precipitated this discussion today was that one of my supporters suggested to me that you're the sort of bloke who's prepared to talk to folks, unlike most of your, shall we say, vegan so-called colleagues, shall we say, who none of whom actually have the stones, as it were, to sit down in front of me for various reasons on a cerebral style discussion. So my hat is off to you immediately, Peter, and you're very, very welcome. We were going to talk a bit today about diabetes type 2, and we'll get to that when we get to it. But first of all, why don't you introduce yourself, tell us a bit more about your background, etc., so we know who we're talking to.
Okay, my name is Peter Rogers. I am an MD, medical doctor, clinical physician. I first started out primarily as an imaging-guided surgeon, as an interventional radiologist. One of the things that sort of got me interested in nutrition was in my 30s, I got fat. And I couldn't believe I was fat, and I couldn't lose the weight for a couple of years. I thought I could just do it with willpower, exercise more, eat less, but that didn't work. Plus, my parents had gotten sick. My father had coronary artery disease, ended up going for open heart surgery. My mother had cancer. And what I kind of came to the conclusion at that point was, I was a great student, and I had read everything in the conventional medical books, but the answers were not there. And what I started to realize was there's much better information coming out of epidemiology, of nutrition and toxicology that physicians never learn. And so that's why I now laugh, now that I got a lot more experience with those subjects, that any person who wants to learn about the management of the chronic Western diseases can learn a lot more on their own than they could reading all the conventional medical books.
Oh boy, you and I are going to have a ball this afternoon, Peter, I would suggest. You've already mentioned one of my favorite bugbears, epididdly-doodly-moodly-mology. We'll get to that as and when we get to it. But in the meantime, why don't you kick us off? Give us your best description, I guess, of when someone says they have type 2 diabetes. What is that? What is the actual pathology? What is it that actually needs to be intervened? What is the dangerous factor?
Well, there's a couple different ways to look at diabetes. And there's a great paper. It was written by Michael Brownlee in 2004. He won the Banting Award, Best Diabetes Researcher in the World. The name of the paper is called The Unifying Theory of Diabetic Complications. If anybody wants to read it, they can get the paper at ada.org, American Diabetic Association.org. If you go to PubMed, you'll just get no abstract available. You won't even be able to see anything. And his research, the guy was a type 1 diabetic himself, so he was trying to learn about diabetes to save his own life. And when he writes the paper, he especially emphasizes what would be called the concept of overnutrition. If you overwhelm the mitochondria, the inner mitochondrial membrane, electron transport, you can get that mitochondria to fail. He says he thinks what's happening is it's overwhelmed with electron carriers. It pumps protons too quickly into the intermembranous space between the outer and the inner mitochondrial membrane, and that causes a back pressure, if you will, that gradient, such that electron transport reverses direction on the inner mitochondrial membrane. And I typically think of that as initially primarily occurring in skeletal muscle due to accumulation of intramyocellular fat. But he also makes the point it's not just intramyocellular fat. He says if you look at other cells like endothelial cells, they are not insulin dependent for their uptake of glucose. They just take up glucose in proportion to the blood glucose level. And he says when you have a chronically elevated blood glucose, hyperglycemia, your endothelial cells will take in too much glucose, and that elevated glucose within the cell will also cause this phenomenon of overnutrition. And when he says overnutrition, what we're referring to here is that it sends a signal to the enzymes in the cytoplasm to not allow any more glucose into the cell. And so if you're talking about skeletal muscle, you'll inhibit the glucose type 4 transporters from releasing their glucose transporters up to the plasma membrane. Normally you have them stored in cytoplasm vesicles. They merge with the plasma membrane, let's say in a skeletal muscle, and then the glucose type 4 transporters allow the glucose into the cell. But in an endothelial cell, for example, the glucose just keeps coming in. And so you get damage to the endothelium in the setting of hyperglycemia. And that, like I said, that's the universal term sometimes referred for this purpose is overnutrition.
Okay. So you seem to be alluding there, Peter, without actually necessarily explicitly saying that type 2 diabetes is chronically elevated blood glucose and nothing else. That's what it is. That is how it is diagnosed. That is the pathology, elevated blood glucose, and it's that needs to be ameliorated. Yes?
Well, kind of, but not exactly, because there's different ways to look at it. One can consider the elevated blood glucose. Yes, you are absolutely correct. It is how one diagnoses the disease. It is how it is officially defined. It is how it is staged and mapped. That is all true. But there's also the case of something that comes before the hyperglycemia, and that's the insulin resistance that I just referred to, sometimes also called overnutrition.
Right. Okay. So that's what you mean by overnutrition. You mean insulin resistance. Okay. How would you respond, Peter, if I proposed to you that insulin resistance is a construct?
Well, it is the case that, there's another researcher named Shulman, and when they infuse by IV lipids into the blood, they will cause insulin resistance, and they don't get as much of that type of an effect by infusing carbohydrate into the veins. And so it appears that the skeletal muscle, being glucose type 4 transporter dependent for uptake of glucose, is especially sensitive to excessive lipids in the blood.
Okay. How do you mean excessive lipids in the blood there, Peter?
Well, especially saturated fat, but fat in general, it appears that it's able to get into the skeletal muscle cell more easily. It's not dependent necessarily on a protein plasma membrane transporter, and that you accumulate intramyocellular lipid within the skeletal muscle cell. Yep. And that appears to be causing an excessive amount of electron carriers going to that intermitochondrial membrane, and then that's leading to this process of
okay. So two key words there that you use, Peter. One, excessive. Please define excessive. And two, where is the measurement of this electron transport?
Well, when I talk about electron transport, I'm referring, of course, to the intermitochondrial membrane.
Yes.
And it'll typically have a gradient, around negative 160 millivolts, which is an incredibly high gradient. It's the highest electrical gradient across a membrane that I'm aware of in the human body.
Okay, that's also a construct though, Peter, isn't it? Because in actual fact, on either side of the membrane, the sum total of all the electrochemical charges is zero on both sides. Ergo, the voltage across that membrane is zero. What we're talking about is a species-specific concentration gradient of various chemicals. In this case, we're talking about the antagonistic effects of fat entering a mitochondria versus carbohydrate entering a mitochondria, or attempting to do so, at ostensibly the same or similar points around the acetyl coenzyme A entry point, yeah? I.e., the Randall cycle is in effect if you have a significant mix of both carbohydrates and fats trying to enter the mitochondria for oxidative process, yeah?
Well, I haven't reviewed the Randall cycle in a while, so I'm not familiar with it. Just, well, first of all, it shouldn't be called a cycle because it's not one. The bloke that proposed it, Sir Philip Randall, called it a cycle for some reason. He called it the glycerol fatty acid cycle, which doesn't make any sense either, really, because it's really nothing to do with that either. And then later it was named after him, the Randall cycle, despite the fact that it's not one. Ostensibly, you have outlined accurately the net effects of carbohydrate and fat both trying to enter the mitochondria at the same time. That being the blockade of the GLUT4 transporter, thus disallowing the entry of blood glucose to the cell according to its concentration gradient in most cells like skeletal muscles. So you got that absolutely bang on. Here's my question for you, though. Insulin resistance, which is a construct used to describe that deactivation of the GLUT4 transporter, is universally imagined to be described as a pathology in need of fixing. It isn't. It exists because of at least
3.8 billion years of positive and negative selection pressures in our metabolic pathways, it exists precisely to protect muscle cells from the damage they would incur were glucose allowed to enter according to its concentration gradient without any control. This is a lock the door from the inside mechanism. Thus, the sacrificial lambs become the epithelial cells of the vascular tree and the formed elements in the tissue of the blood. Example, the red blood cells as being the ones that are most affected, as measured by an HbA1c test. So again, Peter, let me ask you again. Type 1 diabetes, which is diagnosed as elevated, chronically elevated blood glucose. It is the elevated blood glucose that is the pathology. It is the elevated blood glucose that causes the damage to the epithelial cells, nothing to do with fat whatsoever. And as such, the way to ameliorate type 2 diabetes is stop pouring carbohydrates down your neck. Comment, if you please.
Well, I actually think a more effective strategy to reduce one's incidence of type 2 diabetes is to reduce dietary fat.
What would lead you to that? Please, I'm going to let you elaborate, but please, what on earth would lead you to that conclusion?
Well, now I'm getting into what I would call a little bit of the ectopic fat theory of Shulman. Gerald Shulman won the Banting Award, Best Diabetes Researcher in the World in 2018. And
he does some very interesting work with Rothman on testing ATP turnover in cells and things. So great bloke, yeah.
Yeah, and they use a technique called nuclear magnetic resonance spectroscopy, where they could actually see inside a cell the contents. And what they found was the earliest detectable finding for insulin resistance was the accumulation of fat inside a skeletal muscle.
Okay, hold there, Peter, hold there. Insulin resistance, you say, how is that defined?
Well, lack of sensitivity to glucose, it could be defined as, normally the insulin should allow the blood glucose to come down.
Should you say? But hang on, haven't we just decided that
you're right.
The very reason that this is disallowed is to protect the cell from damage. So insulin should not have carte blanche to do what it wants, whenever it wants. Should it, Peter?
Well, you are correct that the cell can overwhelm the effect of insulin in an appropriate context. And then the next question would be, well, what is that context? And
the blood glucose.
I know, but there is the thought of what Shulman says. He thinks it is, like you're saying, an evolutionary adaptation. But in his opinion, what he says is when blood levels of lipid are chronically high, the body senses that it's starving, because we burn more fat when glucose is less available. And he says in response to that hyperlipidemia, the skeletal muscles are not taking up the glucose because he sees it as a way that they can spare the limited availability glucose to keep it available for the brain. Yeah. The brain glucose the most. And also red blood cells run on glucose, because they don't have mitochondria.
Correct.
And the kidney medulla also is dependent on glucose.
Testes need glucose as well. Yep. Absolutely. So it is an adaptative process. So-called insulin resistance, which is universally imagined, described, either directly or by lack of a clear statement that it isn't, as a pathology. It is often also described as insulin resistance is the etiology of type 2 diabetes. Utter nonsense. It's nothing of the sort. Elevated blood glucose is the pathology, and the way to elevate your blood glucose most effectively is to put carbohydrates down your neck, isn't it, Peter?
Well, it depends on what you're talking about. I mean, there's such a thing also. There's two other things that are relevant to this. First of all, one of them I would talk about high fructose corn syrup. That's an interesting subject as well.
Sure.
And that leads when somebody guzzles down a whole bunch of high fructose corn syrup, because it's metabolized different than glucose, it ends up causing the liver to produce lots of uric acid. And that uric acid then comes into the blood. And uric acid is an interesting molecule. In the blood, it causes a lot of problems. It inhibits endothelial nitric oxide synthase. So you make less nitric oxide vasodilator. One of the things that insulin does is when it comes in after eating a meal is it vasodilates skeletal muscle to facilitate its contacting binding receptors on skeletal muscle cells, and thus being able to push glucose into those cells. So when you've got uric acid present in large amounts inhibiting the vasodilation of those muscle capillaries, then what happens is the insulin can't exert its effect as well either, and that leads to hyperglycemia. So that's one of the ways that high fructose corn syrup can also cause this effect of hyperglycemia and insulin resistance, if you will.
All right. So what you've given me is an example of exactly what I've just said, which is the most effective way to elevate your blood glucose is to pour carbohydrates down your neck in some form or another.
I do think high fructose corn syrup is obviously an unhealthy thing.
Sure.
But there's also another concept I would bring up called carbohydrate tolerance. So what carbohydrate tolerance means is if you don't eat any fat and you just eat low-fat meal, your insulin is much more sensitive. The cell's response to insulin is more sensitive, and you can get better clearance of the glucose in your blood from that. So
right.
Glucose
but hang on though, Peter. Hang on though, just a minute. What reason under the sun would you have for eating carbohydrates?
Well, our brain runs on glucose more so than anything else. That's the first choice of food.
Whoa. Just hang on a minute there, Peter. Have you ever heard of gluconeogenesis then?
Yes, the liver has a...
So again, let me ask you the question. For what reason under the sun would you eat carbohydrates?
Well, I think there is a very good reason. I think starch is a very healthy food.
Okay, what would lead you to that belief structure, Peter?
Well, I actually think starch is the healthiest food in the world. And here's why.
But I've asked you to explain why.
Yeah, sure. So a starch is basically, if I could stand up here, starch is a polymer of glucose.
Yes.
And it's all wrapped, if you will, in fiber. So it's low caloric density. When it enters your stomach, because of the low caloric density, you get
calories now. Goodness. Okay. That's for another day too.
You get relatively good stretching of your stomach for early satisfaction of hunger, early satiety. Then it passes into your small intestine, and that fiber has to be peeled off from the food before the glucose is absorbed from your gut into your blood. And because it's a gradual process, you get a slow, steady, prolonged amount of normal blood glucose level, or only mildly elevated after eating prandial. So you satisfy your hunger with a relatively few calories, and that helps a person to maintain a good body weight and also to feel good. You feel good when your blood glucose is in the normal range, so to speak. So those are some of the great benefits of starches, plus plant foods in general that come packaged with other good things like vasodilators, potassium and magnesium, and also with the greens, the nitrates, precursors of nitric oxide. And the plants also have a lot more antioxidants than animal foods. So those are all some of the benefits.
Okay, well, a couple of those things are begging the question fallacies. For example, the benefit of antioxidants in your food. The assertion that plant foods contain more and better antioxidants somehow than does meat. The apparent assumption that gluconeogenesis is not a thing, does not exist, and is incapable of its own accord of keeping your blood glucose at the level it's exactly supposed to be, assuming you are not a type 1 diabetic. So which is it, Peter? Does gluconeogenesis function or does it not? And if it doesn't, can you please point me to the evidence that it doesn't function in human beings? And hasn't done so for 3. Of course I am. I always am, Peter. Always.
Well, you're correct that gluconeogenesis works, and it works very well, and the liver is very good at maintaining a good glucose level.
Right. Let me ask you again, Peter, for what reason under the sun would you consume carbohydrates? You've talked about fiber, which is actually contraindicated in the human enteric system, it seems.
Oh, so, I don't agree with that. Fiber is good for us.
Well, no, absolute rubbish. It's nothing of the sort. There is one and only one clinical or even pseudo-clinical study extant anywhere in the peer-reviewed literature that talks about any kind of clinical outcomes whatsoever in, as it turns out, idiopathic constipation sufferers. N equals 62, which I realize is a small sample size. However, the findings were so unequivocal in that study as to be very, very difficult to ignore, at least in terms of more research would be handy in this field. If you're not aware of where that information comes from, I'd do a search on YouTube of Dr. Paul Mason and fiber, and you'll find it. Fiber is not your friend. Fiber is not health promoting. Fiber is contraindicated, it seems, on the basis of the one extant study only in this field. More research is required.
I would say there's a lot of information that's been known about fiber for a long time, and I would refer to Dennis
reductionist studies, perhaps, in vitro studies, perhaps, nothing in the real world.
Oh, no. This is quite different. This is Dennis Burkitt going back to the 1950s and 1960s. He was a Christian missionary doctor from Ireland who then did some of his training in England, and then he was sent to Africa, and he sort of discovered a pattern of a disease called Burkitt's lymphoma that was subsequently named Burkitt's lymphoma. They put him in charge of the epidemiology for Africa, and he collected data from over 1,000 hospitals, and he saw different patterns of abdominal disease in the Western, like English persons coming to Africa, for example, and versus the natives who were eating a plant-based diet primarily at that time. And he described something called abdominal pressure syndrome.
Yeah.
So basically, when fiber's in the colon, it attracts water to the stool. So it makes the stool softer, more liquefied.
Sure.
When you defecate, it's more like a cow patty rather than a Tootsie Roll. And that has implications. If the fluid is liquid on the right side of the colon, you're less likely to form a pedicle, this little hard, dried out stool balls that can potentially obstruct the appendix. And then the mucus glands beneath continue to secrete mucus, and it can burst, and that's appendicitis. You're less constipated. So when you defecate, you have the less straining of the abdomen, the Valsalva maneuver, and that back pressure of straining due to constipation. When you have dried stool, you're pumping out a Tootsie Roll rather than a cow patty.
Yeah. Okay. Can I just ask you, Peter, just remind us where you went to medical school?
I went to medical school at University of Illinois.
Illinois. Excellent. At what point in your training did they instruct you as to the acceptability of using associative data to infer causality, please?
Well, you have to work with whatever data you have.
Nonsense, Peter. Science is a discipline, Peter. Absolutely, it is not okay to make a causal inference on the basis of associative data simply because you do not have causal data. Not okay at all. Unless the relationship between your variables as actually observed and reported as absolutely observed and not adjusted, unless that relationship is so strong as to be impossible really to ignore. Do you have any of that kind of data that you can point us to with regard to fiber and healthy gut function whatsoever?
Well, it's been shown that populations that eat the high fiber diets.
Now, again, you're talking about an association there. So,
right. That's all the data I've got. And that's quite often.
Right. So that's the admission that you're making. That's the admission that you're making. You do not have the data to support your claim. Neither do I really, except one pseudo-clinical study that actually did attempt to control things reasonably well in a very small group of N equals 62, which showed absolutely unequivocally that fiber was damaging to gut function. Pretty clearly, it looks like. Again, not cause and effect because it wasn't 100% controlled. These were not metabolic wound lock individuals. However, they did some pretty good controls in that study. What they found was a dose-response reduction in idiopathic constipation in their population, according to the reduction of fiber, to the point where every single participant got a 100% remission of all symptomology on a zero fiber diet. Tough to ignore, Peter.
Well, whatever your study showed, that's good for that one research study, but I can tell you there's a lot of data, and I can't give you
a pile of data that is crap, Peter, means you have a pile of crap. It's just a big pile of crap, isn't it? Again, science is a discipline.
And fiber.
Well, no, it's funny, isn't it? But science is a discipline, and what I'm suggesting to you, Peter, is you ought not make cause and effect claims without data to underpin it. So when I say to you, there is one study and one only that talks about actual function in actual human beings in a pseudo-clinical setting is at odds with what you are saying about fiber being good for us. And if you want to get to anecdotes, we can get to that too. But at the end of the day, I myself have eaten ostensibly no fiber whatever for the best part of 10 years. And I can promise you I have no constipation of any kind, no appendicitis of any kind, no bowel function problem of any kind at all. Once a day in the morning, set your clock to it, one and done, no straining, no pressure, not even broken into stanzas, Peter. Lay a rope and we're out of here. No fiber at all. How do you explain that? And others report similarly, is what I'm saying.
Well, I can tell you, though, there's been a lot written about concepts like leaky gut, about gluten sensitivity and all this stuff. And out of that literature, and as well as, Dennis Burkitt's concept of the abdominal pressure syndrome, some of the conclusions of those researchers was that the fiber is used by the gut bacteria to make short chain fatty acids.
Fantastic.
And that's 2-carbon acetate, 3-carbon propionate, 4-carbon butyrate. And in particular, the 4-carbon butyrate is used by the gut lining cells, the enterocytes, to make their tight junctions. It's a single layer of cell.
Absolutely fantastic point, Peter. Tell me, please, what are the major ketone bodies?
Well, and I don't actually think about them too often. I know acetone's one of them.
Acetone is one that's volatile and is usually breathed out at the lungs and is lost to the system.
Like beta hydroxybutyrate.
Oh, there you go. Thank you, Peter. Beta hydroxybutyrate. Now, when the enteric cells absorb these short chain fatty acids from the fermentation of a small amount of fiber, the most common short chain fatty acid absorbed on the lumen side of those enteric cells is butyric acid. It's actually not butyric acid, it's butyrate, if you want to be really, really accurate. And the first metabolic step that occurs to that butyrate before it's metabolically useful is it's transmuted enzymatically to beta hydroxybutyrate, which, Peter, can also be absorbed by the same enteric cells from the blood supply side in a person that eats no fiber or carbohydrates to speak of, can't it? Also, short chain fatty acids are available in butter. So we don't need fiber for that either, actually. That's why I'm not constipated, full of colon cancer and dead about 9 years, 11 months and 2 weeks ago. So what you're saying theoretically is fine, but it's reductionist information out of its context. So no, we don't need fiber for that either. Have you got anything else on fiber that tells me we absolutely must have any, in the face of tens of thousands of us over here in this community that consume no fiber and are not constipated, full of colon cancer, full of little hard poos and not being able to move their bowels? So what you're saying theoretically is great, but in the real world and the objective reality we actually find ourselves, that's not what's happening.
Well, I do think there is a big change in disease since, let's say, going back to the 1970s.
You bet.
Even from when I did my residency in the early 1990s, there's sort of different patterns of disease. More patients are obese and fat. More patients have type 2 diabetes, and they have things that go along with it. More of this so-called abdominal pressure syndrome. We see more hiatal hernia, where the stomach's pouching up into the chest, gastroesophageal reflux, GERD, GERD, and that's associated with more of a different type of esophageal cancer than what we used to see. We used to see smoker drinker cancer.
And what research has been done as to the cause of that change in what is being observed?
Well, I think it's multifactorial.
So
and there is
none. So none is the answer, because there is no experimental work that can pin this down. In fact,
well, it's hard to do a randomized controlled trial on humans. You know,
it's impossible. Sort of ethics committees don't like it, Peter. Have you found that?
Yeah, you know, you're not going to get approved by any committee to do that. But there's a lot of people out there who've looked at the data as best they can. I'll give you one guy.
Right. Well, they've done their best. Bless them. Okay, good.
Yeah, like there's an interesting guy by the name of Chris Knob. I don't know if you ever heard of him.
Yeah, I know Chris Knob.
Yeah, he's an ophthalmologist, and he actually did a pretty extensive study of the epidemiology. And here's the conclusion he came to. He believes the main cause of the increased obesity is all the increased amount of omega-6 cooking oils people are eating.
Yeah, I'm aware of, and so all my viewers, by the way, are also very well educated by me, actually, Peter. So they all understand this too, and they all know Chris Knob, and they all are absolutely on board that omega-6 polyunsaturated fatty acids are completely contraindicated in the human diet. Absolutely, we're on board with that. However, you've just made the fundamental error of using the word cause and epidemiology in the same sentence. Would you like to have another go?
Well, what I'm saying is you work with the data, the best data you can get, and you try to come to conclusions from that as best you can.
Right.
And
so as a discipline, right? No. Extrapolation is the error here, Peter. You cannot extrapolate data.
Well, you have to a little bit.
No, you don't. What you have to do is keep your scientific discipline and say, here is what the evidence can support. And refrain from making cause and effect statements when you have no data to underpin that. None at all, because epidemiology is associative.
It's not the greatest. It's not as good as you'd want, but it's as good as you're going to get, at least at the moment.
Right. So now you're suggesting that there is, in fact, cause and effect data that you can point to that would tell us why people are suffering this syndrome that you're talking about.
Well, you can look for patterns and try to recognize the pattern as best you can.
Yeah, but that
And
doesn't tell us anything about causality, because here's a pattern for you, Peter. What you'll find if you survey people on Miami Beach on any given summer afternoon, and you ask them, have you bought an ice cream today from the ice cream vendor, and you look at them and see if they're sunburned, you'll find a high pattern, a very, very clear correlation between the consumption of ice cream and sunburn at Miami Beach, won't you, Peter? Ergo,
yeah,
what we need to do to get rid of the sunburn scourge is to outlaw the sale of ice creams at Miami Beach. That'll sort it, won't it?
Well, you're right that correlation doesn't always mean causation, but it's also the case that you work with what you got and you try to make some sense out of it. And there's some pretty big data sets that would suggest...
Big doesn't mean good, Peter, does it? A pile of turds that has many, many turds is just a higher pile of turds, isn't it? And
yeah, but
what I'm telling you is that there is
no
good disciplined science that can underpin any statement of cause and effect around hard health outcomes in human beings over any period of time, let alone over long-term. Let's talk about people's long-term health, so-called risks. Well, epidemiology cannot do that, can it?
Well, epidemiology can provide some useful information.
Yes, look on association. If those authors report what they observed rather than what they made up they observed instead. We'll get to that.
Look at China before 1970, when they primarily ate white rice. A billion out of a billion, they're pretty skinny. If you look at the extras in the Bruce Lee movie, they're pretty skinny, except maybe Bolo, probably taking steroids, eating a lot of meat and who knows what. But most of them are all skinny. They had a very
so no other factors impact the health status, body composition of Chinese people prior to 1950 something other than their diet, Peter. Is that what you're saying? Nothing else has had an effect.
The main thing, whether or not people are fat, is their diet. Okay,
How do you know that, Peter?
Well, I believe that is the case because there's been such a dramatic increase in obesity and other things.
I'm not saying I disagree, by the way. I agree with you.
And that corresponds to changes in diets, and that appears to be the most common thing.
So corresponds with. There's another association, isn't it, Peter? There are no experimental works that say this is the case.
That's the best one can do. And I think when the bigger the data set, the more reliable the information is.
Okay, fantastic. I'll let you have that, because I agree with you. I think diet is the most important thing in someone's body composition. You bet. I agree with you on that, although we can't prove it. My next question is there nothing else that happened anytime around the 1950, 1951 threshold that changed other than diet?
Well, in China, there was also starvation, but it's not.
Well, there we go.
Yeah, that helps people to be skinnier.
Right.
But
okay, so your assertion is nonsensical then, isn't it, Peter? It's just rubbish.
Oh, well, hold on a sec. You had a similar phenomenon in Korea and in Japan when they were eating primarily rice-based diets, especially white rice. It only has 1% fat. The people are skinny, and they had a low incidence of diabetes. But you know what? They had a lot of hypertension, but I think that's because they were smoking a lot of cigarettes, and they're eating incredibly high sodium. The Japanese were in the 1960s, for example.
Well, the only time sodium is going to be at all involved in hypertension, Peter, is if that person is consuming significant amounts of carbohydrates, causing significant insulin spikes, and it's that insulin spike that causes the sodium retention, in fact. So remove the carbohydrates, and then the person's kidneys will again return to a normal state of filtering those electrolytes in and out as it should, it seems.
Well, I do know that fructose will increase sodium absorption from the gut and retention by the kidneys. That is true.
Sure.
There's more than one type of sugar, though. Glucose and fructose aren't, exactly the same thing there.
No, not exactly. One is a 6-carbon and one's a 5-carbon, but that's for another day. So, where have we got to? Epidemiology, associative work, uncontrolled associative work, looking at trends and patterns at a societal level, and then having collected data on what the societal trends, in fact, are, the observations made, those observations before they're published are altered by adjustment. So what you're actually reading when you read an epidemiological study, Peter, is a fabrication, because scientists report what they observed. Epidemiologists make something else up and report that instead. And then they make the assertion that their associative data set that's fabricated, as it turns out anyway, is able to somehow inform us on causality. Please explain.
Well, you look at whatever data is available and you see what
You've said that, yeah.
what comes out of it, and you try to figure out what it means. For example, in the book called The China Study by T. Colin Campbell.
Oh my God, Peter, seriously, son, come off it. I'm an intelligent human being. Please don't disrespect me by suggesting that T. Colin Campbell produced anything remotely akin to science. It's not even peer reviewed, for goodness sake. It's his opinion. And it's been debunked by thousands and thousands of decent academics multiple times over the decades. Please, T. Colin Campbell. No, son. What's next?
All right. Well, it is the case that people that have low blood cholesterols are less likely to have myocardial infarction.
Rubbish, okay? Peter. Absolute nonsense. Absolute rubbish. False. Sorry. I can't let you get away with that.
I think there is data to back that up.
No, there isn't. There is adjusted associative data sets that show piss-weak associations at best, even after being adjusted. And even if you were correct and there was a strong association between cholesterol, I don't even know how we got onto that topic, but between cholesterol and heart disease, that is still an association and not a cause and effect artifact because it has not been experimentally verified. And as a disciplined scientist, you are required to refrain from making cause and effect statements where you cannot support them. And epidemiology will not do the job. Does not do the job. Tell me, what is the baseline incidence of cardiovascular disease and death, as it turns out, because the stat is similar, in a population of people typically looked at in these epidemiological studies? What is the baseline rate?
Well, my understanding of it, let's say in the United States, about 26% of people die from coronary artery disease. Okay, it's thought to be the most common cause of death. About 25% die from...
Yeah, okay, I need to stop you, Peter, because you're answering a different question to the one I asked you. In those studies, those epidemiological studies that look at populations of people and try to correlate LDL cholesterol with heart disease, what is the baseline incidence in the risk equals 1.0 so-called referent or so-called control group? How often do those people die per person year of follow-up of heart disease?
I don't know exactly in terms of...
Okay, let me give you the number then. It's 8 per 10,000, give or take. 8 deaths per 10,000 person years of follow-up. In a population, by the way, Peter, which at the outset is usually 60 plus in these studies, precisely because they know they're not going to get an incidence high enough to find statistical significance below that. All right, so we've got 8 per 10,000. At worst, the strongest change in so-called risk, it's not risk, it's association once adjusted, in a group of high cholesterol expressors is 30% increase over baseline. What's 30% of 8 per 10,000, Peter?
Well, it's a pretty small number when you phrase it that way.
Well, that's what it is in the real world, in the objective reality we find ourselves, because people are interested, Peter, in actual events, things that can be observed. Someone either being diagnosed with heart disease, having previously not been diagnosed with heart disease, or indeed dying of a myocardial infarction or other CVD-related incident or accident. 8 per 10,000 and 30% more than that if you have the highest quintile of cholesterol versus the lowest. And even if that was a correct relationship, which it probably isn't because of adjustment, it still is not cause and effect. It's an association. It's sunburn and ice cream sales, Peter. Give me a mechanism by which cholesterol causes heart disease.
Well, it's thought that LDL cholesterol is a bridging molecule.
It's thought that. Shall I stop you right there? Because you've just given yourself away right there, haven't you, Peter? It's thought that. You were invited to give me a mechanism which is established with experimental...
I'll give you the mechanism that's proposed by the research.
The proposed mechanism. Okay, let's hear it.
That's how all this is. So Gregory Sloop, MD, he's considered by a lot of people the best atherosclerosis researcher in the world. He wrote a textbook,
and not by others too. So whatever. It's that's an appeal to consensus fallacy. There,
okay, so just tell us what he said. you got a red blood cell
Yep.
and has a negative charge on its outer surface. That's called a zeta potential.
Sure,
and
yes.
other red blood cells, they both have a zeta potential, so it repels each other, which is
Yep.
good, so they don't clot.
Yep.
Endothelium has a zeta potential, and the white blood cells have a zeta potential. All this stuff prevents unnecessary clotting.
Yep.
And it is thought that bridging molecules, and LDL is thought to be one of them, have a positive charge on their outer surface that can overcome the zeta potential and stick red blood cells together. And then they will clump together in like a stack of coins. The French word is rouleau formation. Sometimes also they'll use the phrase blood sludge. Chylomicrons are thought to have a similar effect. Fibrinogen, the clotting protein, has a similar effect. Uric acid can have a similar effect.
Can have. Okay, so now point us to the experimental work that they've shown this in effect. And then, if we can see that this mechanism is in fact occurring, then what we need to know is, on the balance of all things with all other variables allowed to vary as they do in the real world in a free living individual, do we see a significant increase in heart disease diagnoses and or deaths in a population of people who have higher cholesterol? The answer is no, not meaningfully.
Well, there's other people who would see that a little differently. And
I know that, Peter. I'm aware that people see things differently.
Luke would say basically the higher your LDL cholesterol, they can measure something called blood viscosity, the thicker the blood.
Right.
And the thicker blood means that, the purpose of blood pressure is to get blood to the top of your brain. So the thicker the blood, you're pumping a milkshake, so to speak, instead of water, you have to raise the pressure, so it'll cause more hypertension. So elevated LDL cholesterol has that effect. Also, for example,
but how many other factors also affect the viscosity of a person's blood?
Oh, there's other things that affect it too. A big one is the hematocrit.
Exactly.
I think that's why.
Therefore, this reductionist statement of saying cholesterol can cause this effect in isolation to, let's look at what happens in people in the real world and the objective reality we find ourselves, Peter. Let's go back to even your epidemiology, which, by the way, is adjusted, ergo a fabrication, and yet it still shows a modest, at best, and probably clinically insignificant difference in outcomes as reported. 30% on 8 per 10,000, which, even if that was cause and effect, which it isn't, so what?
Well, a couple of things here too. Biology, medicine's like biology. It's a little bit messy, okay? It's not like physics where we get these beautiful numbers and you can standardize and quantify everything precisely. And in medicine and biology, it's kind of messy. You take the data you got, you do the best you can with it. And so anyways, things that increase blood viscosity are associated with increased hypertension. Increased hypertension is associated with increased atherosclerosis.
Absolutely, I agree with you. Yes, it is. Yes. But there are many things that can cause your blood pressure to be off. Many things. And some of them are constructive interferers and some of them are destructive interferers, such that for you to tease out cause and effect at the end of the day, you have to have your finger on so many variables that it's not going to be realistic for you to be able to make a cause and effect statement. What you do as a clinician is you rely on your training such that it is, you assess how the patient presents to you, you suggest a course of action, and then you follow up at some point with, has that course of action been effective in that patient or has it not? And then on the basis of that, you suggest the continuation of that prescription, if you like, or let's try something different. Now, I have no problem with that because that's the model you guys work under. But when you guys come online and say things like there is evidence for cause and effect, when there isn't, Peter, that's when you and I are going to have a problem. That's when we're going to have a discussion like this. As well natured as this one is, and it's supposed to be, I still need to make my point here. You cannot support a claim of cause and effect in terms of cholesterol and heart disease, cholesterol and blood pressure, cholesterol and heart health outcome of any kind, fiber in any of those things either, carbohydrates in any of those things either, or starch, can you? These are your opinions.
I can't say, no, these are not just my opinions. I
didn't say just your opinion, because your opinion might be shared by others.
There's a lot of research studies that back up the things that I'm saying.
No, there aren't, Peter. There are a lot of studies that are published in the peer-reviewed literature that claim to support what you're saying. That doesn't mean they actually do. Science is a discipline, as I've repeatedly said, and if you want to assert cause and effect, there are certain rules you follow as a scientist to be able to assert cause and effect. Failing that, you have to report your data as an inference. That's where it falls down. Please comment on that.
Well, I would have a couple comments. The first one is there's a doctor by the name. Well, I'll address a couple things. Number one, most doctors, like I said, don't know anything about nutrition, epidemiology, or toxicology.
Correct.
Okay, the training in medical school is basically to become an internist, and the basic mantra of med school is match the ill to the pill and send a bill. Okay,
right.
So it's really training in pharmacology and how to sell drugs.
Yes.
All of this stuff I learned later. But then I would go back to some interesting research. There's a guy by the name of Caldwell Esselstyn, and he was at the Cleveland.
Oh my God. Peter, again, you are talking to an intelligent individual and an intelligent audience. Caldwell Esselstyn undertook a completely uncontrolled naturalistic observation with no control group of any kind, and his intervention was multifaceted, ergo completely incapable of even inferring anything cause and effect. We are done. Let's move on. Caldwell Esselstyn.
Okay, all right, so no. Caldwell Esselstyn, we won't go any more on him, but I got another one to share with you. And he's got bigger data sets. This one is William.
Again, Kepner. Peter, bigger is not better. A big pile of turd is nothing more than a big pile of turd. But carry on.
Okay, but his name's Walter Kempner. He came out.
Oh my God, the roast diet guy now. Okay, boys and girls. Again, Peter, you are talking to an intelligent individual and an intelligent audience. What Walter Kempner did was a naturalistic observation where he made some observations around some associations that he observed in a multifaceted intervention. He did not do experimental science proving cause and effect, or even making a decent inference on cause and effect. Now, as it turns out, any diet which avoids the standard Western, standard American diet is, at least in the short term, preferable to the standard diet, precisely because of the Randall cycle issue I was alluding to earlier. That being, the last thing you should do dietarily is consume a diet which is a combination significantly of carbohydrates and fats with protein. You should pick one of those macros for your energy source. Protein is largely the source of building blocks for your body. And out of those two, carbohydrates or fats, one of those is in line with your genetic gift, your anthropological past as a human being, and is in line with the form and function of your organ systems, your metabolic pathways, all of those things. And one of them is not. The decision is very, very simple. Precisely because 84% of people who ever try a vegan diet quit. They do that within 5 years, and 90% of those people say catastrophic health failure born of nutrient deficiency was the reason. That does not occur in carnivores, because the carnivore diet is genetically, anthropologically correct for human beings. It is the optimum diet for human beings, apparently. And the vegan diet is not, patently. Please, off you go.
Look at my teeth.
They're better than Gregor's, I'll give you that.
They're flat.
Oh, are you going to give me we are not carnivores because we don't have sharp, pointy teeth, though, Peter? Is that what
we're like a horse? I got teeth like a horse.
Oh my God. Okay, Peter.
Our jaw goes side to side.
Peter. You're going from ridiculous to comedic now. Have you heard of a thing called a hagfish, Peter?
I heard of it, but I don't know much about hagfish.
It lives off the flesh of decaying whales at the bottom of the ocean. It has no teeth of any kind. Somebody send it a memo, please, telling it that it's not a carnivore because it doesn't have sharp, pointy teeth like this. Are you stoned? What drugs have you been prescribing yourself, Peter? We're not carnivores because we don't have sharp, pointy teeth. I'll tell you what we do have, Peter. Thumbs, a working brain, some of us, an ability to communicate, conceptually with one another and to plan and strategize and to hunt successfully that way, and the ability to fashion tools like knives. You will not see a cave painting of ancient human beings diving headlong at woolly mammoths with their mouths open, trying to rip their throats open with it. They're holding sharp, pointy sticks. And later on, you'll actually find that some of those sticks are no longer sharp and pointy. They now have an animal gut strung across it, and they have another sharp, pointy stick that they're firing at said mammoths. Okay, sharp, pointy teeth. No, Peter. Try again. Ridiculous. Absolutely.
You remind me of Monty Python and the Holy Grail.
That's where it comes from.
And they would symbolize like the rabbit. That was funny.
Yes. Right. So no, don't give me that. We're not carnivores because we don't have sharp, pointy teeth. Ridiculous.
Also, though, a cat, a real true carnivore, has got a fixed forward bite with its jaw. Our jaw goes side to side, which enables us to grind plants more. It's another reason why I think we do have a jaw for that.
Nobody ever said human beings don't eat plants at all and haven't eaten plants at all. The stable isotope testing tells us exactly what the makeup of the human diet has been in terms of macronutrient, so-called, for the last, several 100,000 years, up to and including, but before the agrarian revolution, where for some reason we decided to change our diets entirely to plant material that we ourselves invented with selective breeding of different plants and things. And it's, the second worst thing we ever did as a species is include any significant amount of plant material in our diets. The worst thing we ever did was seed oils, N=6 polyunsaturates. But that's basically how that goes. The stable isotope testing is in, it's clear, it's unequivocal. There is no question what human beings did eat. And it was 80% or so of their so-called calories, which is for another day, coming in the form of animal protein and animal fat. And about 20% in the form of largely fibrous tubers, in fact. Hence that. What negative selection pressure would be at play to force a change in our jaw structure so that we can no longer do that, given that that is also pretty useful in terms of speech.
That was a good comeback. I'll give you credit for that.
Right. So again, that one is just as stupid inane as that one. What's next, Peter? What have you got for us? Try again.
Get me started on a topic. I need something to get me started. What's the next topic you want to talk about?
Oh, well, we've covered quite a bit already, haven't we? We've talked about how type 2 diabetes is elevated blood glucose and nothing else. We've talked about how insulin resistance is a construct and nothing else. We've talked about the fact that what needs ameliorating in type 2 diabetes is the blood glucose and nothing else. And the way to do that is not eat carbohydrates. We've spoken about the fact that humans need no carbohydrates at all because we have gluconeogenesis whatsoever. We've spoken about the complete lack of a meaningful or useful association between cholesterol and anything else, actually, except that it seems that when you look at the largest data set available on that topic, available anywhere in the world, with several billion, with a B, person years of follow-up, you will find that there is a precipitous increase in mortality from every single major cause of mortality in 168 countries and territories around the world, with a reduction in the total cholesterol below 220 milligrams per deciliter, as it turns out. Precipitous increase. Interesting. Again, that's just an association too, but I tell you what, it's a pretty big one, if big is better, as you seem to keep implying, Peter. So we've dealt with the need for carbohydrate, there's none. The need for fiber, there's none. The need to control or artificially lower our cholesterol, the thing that's set by our genes in the first place, there's no need to do that either. What's next? I mean, you tell me, what do you want to talk about?
Those are all your conclusions. I don't necessarily agree with those conclusions.
No, but you haven't been able to give me any reason to change my opinion.
I'll give you one example. In the Framingham study, they said,
God, really?
Persons who kept their total cholesterol below 150, and Esselstyn says the same thing.
No, not persons, not persons, Peter. Who were the subjects of the Framingham study?
Well, I don't recall that much detail about it, but I know it's a town right next to Boston, and the persons who kept their total cholesterol is below 150.
Well, but hang on. No, persons in Framingham at that time, living under the circumstances they were living at that time, in a fashion which may or may not be representative of a larger population at any other place and at any other time.
Well, they had a lower incidence of myocardial infarcts than the ones that kept
By
the
how
total
much,
cholesterol.
Peter? Lower by how much? What was the outcome statistics on that?
I don't recall.
Well, you shouldn't be sitting there saying they had a lower incidence than Peter if you don't even know what the statistics are.
Well, I can't say one thing though, Eric, again, related to this. Esselstyn compared the number of his patients having cardiovascular events, 198 patients,
yes.
Journal of Family Practice, July 2014.
Yes, we know where the paper is. We've all read it very carefully here.
Right. And then he later compared his data set. Only one out of his 198 patients had a cardiovascular event. He claims it's the patient who follow his diet.
Okay, what interventions did Esselstyn use?
He says he puts his patients on 100% plant-based diet, no oils allowed, no caffeine. And they did this with the goal of reducing their blood cholesterol.
You missed quite a few interventions there in the Esselstyn study. Have you read the thing, Peter?
Oh, I had read all of it, but it's been some years since I've read it.
I think you should read it again then, because what you're saying now is that there were only 2 interventions. You listed 2 and then you stopped.
Well, it was a low-fat, low-sodium vegan diet with no oils, no sweets, no caffeine. He also told them no nuts.
Yes.
No, I think at that time he said no seeds, even though I don't know if he can agree with that.
Yes.
And that's about all that he had them do. He said,
no, Peter. I think you should read the paper again.
He did not have them do any exercise. You're maybe thinking of a separate study, the Ornish study. Ornish had the patients.
I'm not mistaking the Ornish study, which is just as bad.
Maybe not. No. Okay, well, for what that's worth. So anyways, okay, go ahead.
Right. There was one other intervention as well, Peter, wasn't there? He told his patients to continue their statin medications, as well as intervening with their diet. So, which one of those interventions was responsible, mostly responsible, or what were the exact contributions in cause and effect of those 2 quite separate interventions with the outcome?
Well, I don't remember the exact details, but I can tell you this: statins by themselves don't get anywhere near as good of results as what Esselstyn got, which implies that it was in large part due to the diet, primarily due to the diet. Okay,
so a vegan diet is better than the standard Western diet in the short term, precisely because it does not aggravate the so-called Randall cycle issue, i.e. it leads directly cause and effect concomitantly to a lower chronic systemic inflammation overburden. Statins, while being a poisonous, contraindicated metabolic poison that nobody should touch with a barge pole, also serendipitously do tend to have an anti-inflammatory effect as well in the short term. How long was the Esselstyn study, Peter?
Well, that was about 4 years, the one that was published in that article I just referred to.
How long is a human lifespan, Peter?
In the ballpark of 80 years.
Okay. For people who live a standard American lifestyle, sure. Biologically, genetically, what should a human lifespan be if we just got out of our own stupid way?
The longest lived person that I'm aware of was like Jeanette Calmumet or something, the French lady who lived about 122 years of age.
Right, but she also lived a fairly standard lifestyle, so she was just an outlier. What is the genetic potential of a human being if we got out of our stupid way?
The longest lived people that I'm aware of is a Seventh-day Adventist study of people, in the Loma Linda suburb of Los Angeles. By religion, they eat primarily a plant-based diet, but they're not that highly standardized. And the vegan ones of them, the average age of death for the woman was about 89 years of age. Average age of death for the man was about 86 years of age.
Right, but they also don't live anything other than a fairly standard lifestyle with a few minor theologically imposed suggestions on their intakes of diet and alcohol as well, as it turns out.
Yeah, what I think is interesting about them as well is I don't think anybody knows the percentage of fat in their diet.
Okay, let me give you the answer to the question I actually asked you, Peter, which was how long is a genetic lifespan for a human being? It's somewhere between 120 and 150 if we got out of our stupid ways, our own stupid ways.
That sounds to me like it might be possible, but I don't think anybody knows.
No, they don't. That statement comes from discussions with comparative anatomists, physiologists, and geneticists who focus on the kingdom of Animalia, basically. And they're saying, look, given the structures we see here and the genes we see here versus the ones we see in other long-lived animals, I think human beings should live to about 120 to 150 if we actually lived a species appropriate, genetically appropriate, anthropologically appropriate lifestyle. Fine. What percentage of 120 even is 4 years?
Not much.
Right. So the Esselstyn study was short-term, as well as being confounded by the fact that there are covariates and collinearities like statins interfering. He also had them in counseling groups. So there was social connectivity that the control so-called population didn't get. So no, Esselstyn didn't prove anything. He did a naturalistic observation that might be interesting for some people. A scientist would look at that straight away and go, well, you had more than one intervention. We're done here. That's not science. What's next?
Well, we've covered a lot of stuff. You can go ahead, suggest a topic.
Well, I don't know. I think we've covered a lot of ground, as you say, as well. And I think we've pointed very, very clearly to the flaws, the fallacies, the tendency to go to theology and completely abandon scientific discipline. I mean, the so-called literature that you've cited to me this afternoon in this discussion, Peter, basically unfortunately makes you the laughingstock of my entire audience. I'm sorry, because they are well trained in science by me, and none of those studies are science. They're all theological claptrappery propaganda, stuff that's been published because they got it past a couple of peer reviewers, not because they've done good science. I wonder, do you have anything that would qualify as remotely, relatively good science that could remotely underpin your theological belief in vegan lifestyles?
I could give you some more examples if you let me say them from an epidemiological point of view. In Kenya, 1929, Journal of Lancet, Donison's the author, 1,800 consecutive admissions, not a single patient with high blood pressure. Whereas in the United States, there's tons of patients. It's more common than not in patients, let's say over 50, that they're hypertensive.
Okay, fantastic. My response to that immediately, Peter, will be, so what?
Okay, well, atherosclerosis is the main risk factor. I'm sorry, hypertension is the main risk factor for atherosclerosis.
Oh, hang on. I thought it was cholesterol that was the main risk factor.
Well, it depends how you phrase it, and they go together because the elevated cholesterol is going to contribute to causing hypertension because it increases blood viscosity. Pressure has to go up. Not
necessarily, Peter. We've covered that. Right. No, not necessarily at all. There are many factors that affect a person's blood viscosity. I'll give you an example of that right now, if you like. On my desk in front of me right here is a mouse pad, which is electrically connected to Earth. Here is my left index finger. I'm now touching the mouse pad, which I haven't been for the last few minutes because I've been sat back here going, my God, I can't believe what Peter's saying here. Now I'm connected electrically to the Earth. Guess what just happened? My blood viscosity just reduced by a factor of 3.
Oh, you think it's that big? Grounding?
I know it's that big. I've seen the studies, Peter. The clinical studies that show that
it's hard to believe, but that's interesting.
So did I the first time I
grounding just from touching your mouse pad?
That's right, because it's electrically grounded to the Earth. There's a wire that comes off my mouse pad. That wire goes across my desk, out the window, to a stake in the ground outside. It is electrically grounded, and it's an electrically conductive mouse surface.
So does that have a special name? Grounded mouse or something? I never heard of that before.
That's just, I mean, grounding is something you should look up, Peter.
Well, I'm not aware of that in a mouse.
Well, it doesn't matter what the thing is. Okay, whether it's a mouse pad or whether it's a under your bed sheet sleeping mat that you sleep on, whether it's a strap you put around your wrist, it doesn't matter how you ground. I could take my shoes and socks off and go and stand on the grass outside. It would achieve the same thing. There is a near instantaneous reduction in blood viscosity associated with being electrically grounded of a factor of 3. My cholesterol didn't change during that instantaneous period.
I can give a couple more epidemiological
please. We haven't had enough laughs today already. Go on.
in one of the cohort groups in the China study, I know you're not thrilled with that book, but he mentioned that they had the real low cholesterols. They had something like 1,000 autopsies at some hospital, like only 1 myocardial infarction, whereas in a Western hospital, there would probably be about 26% of the patients or so. And I've heard similar numbers for some autopsy study. I don't remember exactly where it was in Africa, but I think it was Kenya where they ate a plant-based diet. I'm not positive about that.
Okay.
That
My response, Peter, is so what? My response is so what? That's an association, and it's probably not even an association that was observed.
Right. And
it's probably been adjusted.
Biology is kind of messy, but basically in these plant-based eating populations where they got low total cholesterols, they have a marked reduction in the number of patients dying from coronary heart disease.
No, they don't. We've already covered this, Peter. No, they don't. What is the incidence baseline in the 1.0 so-called risk referent group in that study? Well, again, you're going to say, I don't know, aren't you, Peter?
I'm going to say that I think the incidence of coronary artery disease related death is more common in the meat eating population, much more so than these plant eating populations.
Okay, so my response to that, even if that were
I don't
correct,
have the exact number at the moment, but my
recollection, you don't have any numbers. Even if you were correct about the numbers, Peter, which you're not, my response is, so what? Association.
Well, there is a lot of data too. For example, I mean, part of it too is just getting a patient to lose weight. If you get them to lose weight, they're less likely to be diabetic, and quite often they're
right. Now you're talking sense. Yes, that is correct. Someone that, well, it's not weight they should lose. It's fat specifically they should lose, isn't it, Peter? Not weight. It's fat.
Well, especially the fat. You're right. That when they reduce their body fat, and in particular, for example, there's a Roy Taylor. Roy Taylor won the Banting Award in 2012, best atherosclerosis researcher in the world, and he found patients who had type 2 diabetes 4 years or less. If he got them to lose weight, and he did it in different ways, like calorie reduction and these special nutrient shakes and all that. It doesn't really matter, I don't think, how they lose the weight. But the patients who lost the weight, he measured with MRI the amount of fat they had in their liver at baseline. Let's say they had about 36% liver fat. Once they lost approximately 30 pounds or so, their liver fat, it was like the first spot to lose fat from, would drop down to about 2%. And all of the patients, virtually all of them, recovered from their type 2 diabetes once they kind of were able to reduce their liver fat. And then you can kind of ask yourself too, what causes liver, fatty liver? Alcohol, being obese in general, high fructose corn syrup. They think that glyphosate stuff sprayed on the non-organic food also contributes to that in a big way. High fructose corn syrup, I don't know if I said that before. So those are some of the things that contribute to it. Plus, I see fatty liver all the time. I can tell you the majority of Americans over 50, I can't give you an exact percent. I would ballpark it probably at about 60% have fatty liver.
And that's just because they eat a standard diet, which is a mixture of fat and carbohydrates, with protein as their third intake. And that's the wrong thing to do nutritionally. Pick one of those, fat or carbohydrate and protein. That is how the diet should be made up. One of those is appropriate for human beings long-term, and one is not, Peter. We're back to where we started. My original question for you was, why on earth would you believe your, what I can only describe as a theological belief in the vegan diet?
Well, I know from my own personal experience, it believes that it helped me optimize my own body weight. My energy level and all that is good as well.
Okay, so it was better than the standard diet that you were on beforehand?
Well, I wasn't on a standard diet, but I was on something that you might call sort of like a modified Mediterranean diet. And I ate better than the standard. I've always eaten better than the standard American diet. But as I've progressively become, I've been a low-fat, low-sodium vegan for years now. And for many years before that, I was a vegetarian. I was sort of a lacto vegetarian. I used to drink skim milk with my cereal, for example, and my coffee. But I've actually quit all animal-based foods, and I've quit coffee as well.
Right. So is it, do you think, a vast deficiency of perfectly healthy, saturated animal fats largely that causes you to believe that people like Esselstyn, Ornish, T. Colin Campbell, for example, have done any kind of science when they haven't? Or is that just a hole in the training?
I think they have achieved something useful.
Possibly, but not science.
Well,
and not proof of cause and effect.
The word science, because I think you're unrealistically demanding. You know, with biology and medicine, it's kind of a big sloppy mess, and you do the
Well,
best.
hang on, Peter. The only demand that I am placing upon my fellow commentators upon the science is that they contain themselves and they discipline themselves to refrain their commentary to within that which can be established by science, experimental science. That's my demand. Now, people might ignore my demand, and they do on a daily basis online, in fact. And you've done so today as well by suggesting that T. Colin Campbell did some science, which he didn't, or that Ornish or Esselstyn did science when they didn't.
Well, these are not physics, okay? This is epidemiology, which is a bit messy, but I can give you two
right,
additional.
So not science. Good, okay. Right.
Two additional populations would be, first of all, we can compare the Tarahumara to the Pima. In northern Mexico by Copper Canyon, Sierra Madre Mountain, the Tarahumara have kept their old-fashioned way, eating lots of corn and beans, local greens, some squash, and they're very healthy. They're famous for running 100 miles in 2 days. Tarahumara and having similar blood pressures in their teens as they do when they're older. And in comparison, there, of course, is the Pima population, which were absorbed into Arizona after the Mexican-American War of 1848. And they do eat a standard American diet, and they have tremendous obesity and everything that goes with that, hypertension, coronary artery disease, etc.
Right. So the fact that they became involved with the Western society and started to eat the Western diet would also suggest, Peter, that they became exposed to the Western lifestyle and ideology, and therefore that there were covariates, confounds, collinearities. That means that there is no way for you to make any comment whatsoever on cause and effect when you're comparing those two populations in any way, shape, or form.
I can certainly say the Tarahumara, by sticking to their old ways, they have incredible endurance, and Nathan Pritikin patterned his diet after them. And another similar example would be looking at the Yanomamo. The Yanomamo is a population of persons sort of in the Amazon jungle near the borders of Brazil and Venezuela. And they also eat a primarily plant-based diet, and they're known to have,
You've sat with them and you know that for a fact, do you, Peter? Or is that just what you've read?
I just know from the papers
right,
I've read
so you
about.
haven't actually seen what they eat at all, because you're probably going to turn around at some point and tell me that Okinawans live on primarily rice and sweet potatoes.
Well, they used to eat a lot.
Which they don't.
Used to eat a lot more sweet potatoes. There was
in fact, Peter, what they used to eat a lot of and still do is pork. And I think you'll find that that's nothing whatever to do with plants. Okay, so that's just a preempt if you're going to start going blue zones and what the facts are about what people do and don't eat. And in any case, I think where we're going here is yet another example of you talking about some study that has reported some association or other, having first actually adjusted their data so that what they're reporting is actually not what they observed at all. So not science. Yeah?
Well, I'm not agreeing with you. I mean,
you're also not refuting me, because it's impossible to refute me, because what I'm giving you here are the facts. I didn't write the disciplines of science. It wasn't me that put the scientific methodology together. That happened 2,500 years ago, Peter. Now I'm getting on a bit, but I'm not 2,500 years old, I can promise you. Okay, so it's not me being unreasonable. It's not me demanding anything other than I am trying to encourage other commentators to stop and think before they open their stupid mouths on social media and say things that are demonstrably, well, as inane as we can't be carnivores because we don't have sharp, pointy teeth, though. Come on, son. No? Is this going up anybody's flagpoles at all? What I'm doing here is I'm inviting Peter to justify scientifically his belief in the vegan ideology. Now, it's not a fair question on my part because he cannot do it. There is no way to do it. Squeaky chair. I need some. Pss, pss. I wonder if that's plant-based, that squeaky stuff. Don't know. I think it's actually petroleum.
I actually do believe that the epidemiology strongly supports a low-fat plant-based diet.
Well, you're wrong, Peter. It does no such thing. Those are the facts. I'm sorry. There is no way around this. Epidemiological studies, by their very design, are completely uncontrolled, naturalistic observations of large groups of people to, as you say, look at patterns. What they cannot do under any circumstances to any degree at all is inform us on cause and effect relationships. That is without the capacity or out with the capacity of epidemiology. It cannot do that. Do you have any science to talk about with me today?
Well, I'd say, for example, if you look at a textbook, there's a guy by the name of William Osler, famous doctor, excuse me. And according to him, you almost, in his big textbook of internal medicine around 1900, 1910, 1920, there was almost no mention of coronary artery disease and myocardial infarction. It's sort of only come into being common as, the diets become more westernized. All right. Sure. So before that time, hardly anybody is known to have coronary artery disease. There's hardly anybody had diabetes. Hardly anybody was fat.
That's right.
So the more we've gotten into this modern version of the diet, and it's not just one thing, it's multiple things. I believe.
There you go. There you go. It's not just our diet that's changed in the last 100 years.
Well,
Many things are very different.
Many things have changed. We're also more sedentary, of course. Yes. I think there's multiple things in the diet that are contributing to obesity. One of them is the increased omega-6 cooking oils. Another one is high fructose corn syrup.
Yes,
Another thing not widely talked about is there's a lot more estrogenic chemicals in our food and in our water.
Yes.
They'll give them to animals because it's a fat storage hormone to make the animals get fat faster. They also leave it in the water. It's too expensive for municipal water filtration to remove estrogenic chemicals from the water. When people drink this water, these estrogenic chemicals, I believe, are having an obesogenic effect on them.
Sure.
And they're surprisingly common. A lot of personal care products have preservatives that are estrogenic in them.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, so I think
all absolutely great, all possibilities. And I tend to agree with all of them based on the observational stuff. What I can't do is prove any of those things are facts, and neither can you, because that's what scientific discipline requires. It requires us to refrain from making comments that are unsupported, cause and effect.
Well, you have to take what you've got and make the most sense you can out of what you've got.
You've repeatedly said that, and I've repeatedly corrected you because it's false. Okay.
No, it's not.
What you have to do, Peter, is refrain from making conclusions that are not supportable with evidence. Because, if nothing else, the Hippocratic Oath demands that of you. It says, first do no harm. And if you tell somebody that they need to go on a vegan diet for their lifespan, because that, in your opinion, is the healthiest diet for a human, you are doing that person harm, unequivocally. Because that is not an appropriate diet long-term throughout the lifespan for a human being. Demonstrably so. Opinion. It's not my opinion. 84% quit rate within 5 years, and 90% of those people say the reason they quit was catastrophic health failure.
I don't think they've had catastrophic health failures. I've become healthier and healthier the more plant-based I've gone, and I've seen that in a lot of people. But just most people can't figure out a routine that they're happy with, and I think the secret of doing that is to eat a starch-based diet.
Right, so they never really were vegans and they did it wrong, Peter. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah, it's been my experience. Most people can't. Plus, also, a lot of the food is very addictive.
So hang on. Let me just check. I just offered that to you. What you're suggesting is they never really were vegans and they did it wrong, and you just said yes. Is that what you mean?
Yeah, that's what I'm saying. Right.
Wow.
For example.
Wow, boys and girls, there you go. There it is. Now we've got the full set. No sharp, pointy teeth. Our jaws do that, and they never really were vegans, and they did it wrong, though. Good.
Well, the reason I would say that is in my personal experience of the people I know. If you try a lot of these processed foods, for example, they not only do a lot of research to get just the right amount of salt, sugar, and fat, also the right amount of glutamate. And they make the people quite addicted to them. So unless you have a strong aversion to that food based on thinking it's bad for your health, you're going to want to go back and eat it. It's like having an old girlfriend. You're going to want to go back to her unless you realize, she's a HIV positive prostitute. And so you say to yourself, I'm going to stay away from her because she's nothing but trouble for me. Yeah. And so what I'm saying is I have that type of aversion to processed food, for example. Sure. And I don't eat animal food also because I think there's significant health problems related to it.
Great. Let's talk about that then. There's a good one. Okay. What are the health risks, so-called, associated with animal food consumption? With in mind the discipline that will require you to provide evidence of cause and effect for me.
Well, I'll give you what I'm aware of with animal food. The amino acid composition is different from animal protein than from plant protein.
Of course it is.
The amino acid composition of animal protein has more leucine. It's a branched chain amino acid.
Yes.
And it tends to be the rate limiting step for activation of mTOR. and activation of mTOR is thought to, it's like a nutrient.
Okay, so a reductionist so-called relationship between the consumption of meat and the activation of a metabolic pathway in vitro, and often not even with human tissues, is what you're talking about there. Okay, fine. If you're correct in that reductionist pathway, that mechanism is a problem, then it should lead to significantly, meaningfully different rates of death over a long period of time in a cohort. Do we see that? The answer is no. We don't.
Dr. McDougall said he just reviewed the literature on low-carb diets.
Dr. McDougall is not a scientist. Dr. McDougall is not competent to analyze literature. Dr. McDougall is not competent to even do science, as we've already discussed in this discussion.
Well, for what it's worth, he claims that all the studies that have been done on the subject show that they die sooner, the patients eat low carb.
Well, he's wrong. They don't show that. There are no studies that show that at all in any meaningful way. And the ones that do are adjusted, Peter.
Okay,
they
well,
do not look, I'll give you an example of this adjustment, just so you can get it clear, hopefully. I'm sure you have heard of the Adventist Health Study number 2. Done by the fine folks at the Loma Linda University with their fine theological adherence to the Church of Latter-day Saints. In that population of people, where they had 5 cohorts or sub-cohorts, vegans, and then the first, second, third, and fourth quartile of meat consumption in that population. They followed those people for X number of years, and they traced their rates of development of serious diseases like cancer and heart disease and diabetes, etc., and their death rates from all causes. Here is what they found. Here is what they observed. The lowest incidence of death and of diagnoses of serious diseases, all of them, the lowest incidence was in the group who ate the most meat. The second highest incidence was the second highest meat consumption, so forth, to the point where the highest incidence of death and disease was in the vegans in the Loma Linda study. Then they adjusted their data and reported 180 degrees out of phase with reality with that, and said the other relationship was true, that the more meat you eat, the higher your rates of death and disease. Look at the raw data, Peter.
My recollection of the Seventh-day Adventist data was the more plant-based and vegan they were, the lower obesity they had and the lower diabetes they had. That they were healthier.
False, though, Peter.
Well, that's my recollection of the data.
That's because that's what those authors wrote, and that's what they want you to believe their data showed. What's required of a scientist is to look at the data and see whether the data does in fact say what those authors claim it said, and it doesn't. Go and look at the bloody data. You've been had.
I'm kind of smiling because this reminds me of when I read the book Alice in Wonderland and her conversation with Humpty Dumpty, and Humpty Dumpty wouldn't let her get away with anything in conversation. And you're kind of like that.
That was the whole point. I did warn you, Peter, that that's what this would be, that I would want.
That's okay. It's okay. I like it down. That's good.
Yeah. All right. So what you've repeated every time I challenge you to come up with anything that's evidentiary in any way to support your theology, you come up with either you name drop someone who's actually an imbecile, or you throw me epidemiology, which will not do the job.
Well, I think epidemiology is about the best evidence we have of health.
That doesn't mean it is evidence. The best evidence that we have, or the closest thing to evidence we have, is not evidence in and of itself, precisely because it can not inform us on cause and effect. It does not have that capability.
Well, I can give you a couple like epidemiological samples. We know that the SAD diet doesn't work. That just makes people fat and sick. Okay.
Agreed. Absolutely.
We can agree on that.
Yes.
But then what I've heard, for example, let's talk about a meat-eating population, the Maasai. Now, the Maasai are known to be relatively thin. They exercise quite a bit. They follow their livestock around. But I read an autopsy study on them that said they did have lots and lots of atherosclerosis. So despite a tremendous amount of exercise, they had a lot of atherosclerosis, for what that's worth. Also, I read something similar in a way about the Eskimos, the Inuit population, that they had a lot of health problems, and they eat a very high meat diet in the sense, with a lot of fish.
Okay, so are we talking Inuit? Are we talking Inuit who live a traditional lifestyle, or Inuit who live today now and have been affected by Western society and have a lot of sugary snacks and shit in their diet as well?
Well, it's been a while since I read about the Inuit, but my recollection of it was that it was ones eating a more of their traditional, fish-based diet.
Hey, right. So what?
Well, that's an example of a largely
Of an
meat-based
association, and it's an association between somebody's or a group of people's reported diet and a report on some outcomes which have been adjusted from what they actually were. So that's not science either, is it, Peter? No amount of epidemiological studies can inform on cause and effect, not one jot.
Well, I don't think you can say not one jot. Maybe they're not as good.
I just did. Did you not hear me? I just did say that. And I said it because it's correct.
Well, if you got one population, a bunch of rice-eating Asians, and they're all skinny, and you got a bunch of people eating another way and they're fat, that's good evidence that the rice eating is going to make you skinnier.
No, it isn't. What other factors differ between those two groups other than their diet, Peter?
Well, you're right that you would like to have it a more precise controlled study, but we usually don't get that. You're also true.
That's not my problem.
Well, there's also the case that
science requires discipline and it requires a controlled observations. That is not what epidemiology is. Ergo, it cannot inform on cause and effect. Why is this difficult to understand?
Well, I just think you got to take the best available evidence.
You've said that, and we've dealt with it.
Do the best you can.
You've said it 3 or 4 times during this discussion, and it was wrong every single time. Scientists are disciplined. Now, you're talking about science here, or proposed science at least. Ergo, it behooves you, its responsibility is placed, as soon as you open your mouth publicly and talk about science, you are now expected to follow scientific discipline in your discussion of that science, because that's what we're talking about, science.
But I'll also say that my sense of this conversation is when you say science, you're kind of referring to things like an engineer or a physicist, where you can very precisely determine a lot of things, and you can often do it quickly and definitively, versus in biology, medicine, and health, very often the data sets are not as easy to control if you can control them at all. And so you do have to do more, trying to come up with a mechanism, a theory, a hypothesis, test it as best you can, analyze it as best you can, and go from there. We don't have like a bunch of humans that we own like farm animals, and we can just make them do totally different things and control the data. It's just not that easy to do. So we got to work with what we got, which tend to be these long-term epidemiological follow-up studies.
Okay, so that being the case, what we need to say is to the public, as a group, we need to all sing off the same hymn sheet. And it goes like this. There is simply no experimental science extant anywhere in the literature that can inform us on what we should or should not eat if you are looking in the ring-fenced area of ideology known as human nutrition science, the literature. You are looking in the wrong place. There is no evidence there of any kind that can inform us on cause and effect or likelihood. That's the discipline. Not, well, we don't have any evidence for a claim, but we are going to make the claim anyway because it theologically suits us. I, Peter Rogers, believe in the plant-based diet, ergo I'm going to tell people there's good evidence for cause and effect there. There isn't, Peter. It's irresponsible, it's disingenuous at best, dishonest in the middle, and actually it's malpractice at worst, because it's at the end of the day, Peter, you're an allopathic physician, aren't you? You are not trained in nutrition at all. Not one jot.
I am not. Well, theoretically, they tell us that we're trained in nutrition because we take a lot of biochemistry classes and nutrition is bundled in with that. But in reality,
how long did you spend learning nutrition in your rotations, Peter?
Well, I took plenty of biochemistry when I was an undergraduate at Stanford. Then I took biochemistry when I was a medical student at the University of Illinois. But I didn't really think about it from a nutritional point of view until I was in my 30s. And I was concerned because I got fat for a couple of years. And I was like, oh my God, I got to figure this out or I'm going to end up being a fat diabetic and all this other stuff. So it took me a little while to figure it out. But once I figured it all out, I lost all the weight and I've kept it off for
okay,
over 20
good.
years.
I'm pleased that you've kept the weight off at least. You've found a lifestyle that seems to suit you, at least for some reason, at least for now. It'll be interesting to see, in 30, 40, 50 years from now, what's going on. This will be a debate that continues ad infinitum, I suspect, precisely because we don't have the answer. If we had the answer, if the science existed, there'd be nothing further to debate any longer. The fact that we are debating means we don't have the answer, which has been my point all along. Unfortunately, Peter, I am absolutely out of time. I do have another appointment right now, but look, it's been an absolute pleasure. I've enjoyed myself. I've been playing the character a little bit today, but by the same token, I just really wanted to point to the absolute lunacy of some of the things being said by people in the plant-based community. And you've helped us out today, Peter, by saying some of those incredibly stupid things yourself, unfortunately. And my people will find that hugely amusing, I'm sure. I really do need to go, though. Do keep in touch. I'd be more than happy to have another discussion with you at another time.
It's my pleasure chatting with you. It was fun.
All right, cool. Thanks for that. And we'll catch up with you again soon, hopefully. Okay, thanks, boys and girls. See ya.